All right, so welcome to today's deep dive. And we are going to get into some pretty interesting stuff, I think.
Yeah, it should be fun.
We are going to be talking about urban prepping, and specifically, how to deal with civil unrest. We are looking at the Urban Prepper's Guide by the Portuguese prepper. If you had a chance to
Cool.
check this out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is right up my alley. This isn't just your typical zombie apocalypse prepper stuff. This is like real world. Like, how do you deal with things going sideways in the city? It gets into some pretty specific strategies, which is cool.
Right, like you see it in the movies all the time, total chaos erupting out of nowhere.
Right.
But in the real world, there are usually at least some signs that things are about to, hit the fan. So what are we looking for? What are some of those subtle indicators that maybe things are about to go a little sideways?
Well, the author breaks it down into 4 key warning signs. And the first one is probably the most obvious: rising social tensions.
Okay, so you're talking about like those hot button issues that everybody's arguing about online and on the news.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about people disagreeing. I mean, that's always going to happen. It's more about the intensity and the nature of those arguments.
So it's like looking beneath the surface to see if there are some deeper societal cracks that are starting to form.
Exactly. And then you've got political instability, which can obviously make things a lot worse.
Okay, so think like a really controversial election or a sudden policy change that people are strongly opposed to.
Right. Anything that really throws fuel on the fire, basically.
And of course, in this day and age, you can't talk about social unrest without talking about misinformation.
Yeah. And the guide actually emphasizes this a lot. You know how rumors and straight-up disinformation campaigns can spread like wildfire on social media? Well, that can turn a tense situation into a full-blown riot pretty quickly.
It's crazy how fast things can escalate online, right? One minute it's a debate, and the next minute it's calls for action, and not always peaceful ones.
Right, and that's why the Portuguese prepper is really big on double-checking your sources. He says stick to reliable news outlets and official channels, and anything that seems too sensational or plays on your emotions, just treat it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say you start seeing these warning signs. Things are starting to heat up in your city. What's the next step? Do you just run out and buy all the bottled water you can find?
Well, no, not exactly. The guide is really big on having an escape plan in place before things hit the fan.
Okay. So like having a fire escape route, but for civil unrest. But where do you go? How do you even figure that out in advance?
That's where it gets interesting. He recommends actually mapping out multiple escape routes from your neighborhood
Okay.
and specifically avoiding major roads or potential conflict zones.
So like maybe knowing your way around back alleys and less traveled streets.
Exactly. Think outside the box, literally.
Like know your neighborhood on a different level.
Yeah. And he also talks about prearranging meeting points with your family just in case you get separated.
That's a good point because, cell service might be down. So
Yeah.
you can't rely on just calling each other. Got to have a backup plan.
Right. And clear communication in advance is key. Everybody needs to know the meeting points and what to do if things go wrong, so everybody's on the same page.
Right. So we've got our escape routes mapped out. We've grilled the family on meeting points. But let's say things escalate really fast and leaving just isn't an option. What then?
Well, then it's all about turning your home into a safe haven. This is where the guide gets really tactical.
So are we talking like boarded up windows and sandbags piled against the door? Like a full-on siege situation?
It doesn't have to be quite that dramatic, but he does recommend practical steps like reinforcing entry points. Things like extra locks, maybe reinforcing the door frames.
And I'm guessing having a safe room is a good idea too. Like a place where you can feel secure if things get really bad outside.
Yeah, that's actually a core concept in the guide. He calls it a resilience room, and it's not just about hiding. It's stocked with essential supplies. Water, food, first aid, a portable power source, even a fire extinguisher.
So it's kind of like a mini bunker, but designed for riding out a very specific kind of storm.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where you can maintain a sense of control and self-sufficiency, even when the world outside feels chaotic.
He also talks about establishing a neighborhood watch, right?
Yeah, that's another big one.
Yeah.
He believes that during times of unrest, community vigilance becomes more important than ever. He actually has a whole section on how to organize a neighborhood watch effectively.
So it's not just about protecting your own home. It's about working together to keep the whole neighborhood safe. Power in numbers, right?
Right. And that sense of community can be a powerful psychological boost, too. Knowing you're not alone in facing this situation can make a huge difference in your ability to cope with the stress and fear.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say for whatever reason, you absolutely have to venture out during a period of unrest. Maybe you need medical supplies or you're trying to reach that prearranged meeting point. How do you navigate a city that's basically a danger zone?
Well, he's got some really good advice on this, too.
Yeah.
Plus, stresses the importance of staying informed about the situation in real time.
So constantly checking the news. But what if the power's out or the internet is down?
Well, that's where you got to get creative. He recommends diversifying your information sources. So think about things like local radio stations, those battery-powered weather radios people use for tornado warnings. They can be lifesavers during
So
unrest.
it's about going old school, relying on technology that doesn't need Wi-Fi or cell service.
Exactly. He also suggests tapping into local networks. Think about neighborhood forums, community bulletin boards, even those old-fashioned landline phones. They can become really valuable sources of hyper-local information.
It's funny how a crisis can force us to rediscover these older forms of communication that we often take for granted.
It is. And let's not forget about the power of just, looking out your window, talking to your neighbors. You can learn a lot just from direct observation.
Yeah, situational awareness, right. Okay, so we're informed, we have a plan, and we're cautiously venturing out. What about gear? What does he recommend having in our urban prepping toolkit?
He breaks it down to a few key categories. The first one is obviously, the basic survival essentials: water, food, first aid kit that goes beyond the basic Band-Aids, a portable power bank for your electronics, fire extinguisher.
Okay, so covering the fundamentals: hydration, nutrition, basic medical care, and safety if there's a fire. What else?
Then there's communication, which we already talked about, but it's worth emphasizing the importance of having a backup plan if your phone dies or cell service goes down.
So walkie-talkies, maybe even a ham radio if you're feeling really ambitious.
Exactly. And this is where it gets a little bit more, tactical. He also talks about self-defense tools.
Okay, this is a sensitive topic for sure. What's his take on that?
Well, he's very clear that self-defense is a last resort, and he definitely prioritizes non-lethal options. So things like pepper spray, personal alarms, even those really high-powered tactical flashlights that can temporarily disorient an attacker.
So it's less about, being Rambo and more about just having a way to deter a threat or create an opportunity to escape.
Right. And he stresses that, any self-defense tool is only effective if you know how to use it properly. So training and practice are essential.
It's not just about having the tool, it's about knowing how and when to use it effectively. And let's be honest, under stress, our fine motor skills and our decision-making abilities can go right out the window.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why he actually emphasizes the importance of mental preparedness, which we'll dive into more a little bit later. It's not just about having the right gear, it's about having the right mindset to navigate a crisis situation.
Well, that's a perfect segue to our next topic. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve into the psychological and emotional aspects of urban prepping. All right, so we're back, and while we've been talking about all this gear and planning, one thing that keeps coming back to me is the mental side of prepping. Like, how do you actually stay calm and focused when everything around you is going haywire?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the Portuguese prepper actually addresses that directly. He has a whole chapter on what he calls mindset management.
Okay, so it's not just about having a bug-out bag in a safe room. You need to have the right mental tools as well.
Exactly. And it goes way beyond, just taking deep breaths.
Okay, because let's be real. In a high-stress situation, my deep breathing usually sounds more like panicked hyperventilating.
Right. He actually talks about a specific technique called tactical breathing. It's what soldiers and first responders use to regulate their heart rate and stay calm, even in really intense situations.
So it's like a mental emergency brake that you can pull when your brain is about to redline.
Exactly. It's a specific pattern of inhaling and exhaling that helps to calm your nervous system down really quickly. And he also talks about visualization techniques, which I thought were really interesting.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. Is that where you kind of mentally rehearse different scenarios so that if something bad actually happens, you're not totally caught off guard?
Yeah, it's kind of like building up a mental callus, so to speak, so that when you're faced with a real crisis, you've already kind of pre-lived it in your mind and you know how to react.
That's actually a really good analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about escape plans, fortifying your home essential gear, and now mental preparedness. Is there anything else in the guide that really stood out to you?
One thing that I found really thought-provoking was his emphasis on community preparedness. He actually argues that relying solely on yourself might not be the best approach.
Really? That's interesting because a lot of the prepper stuff you hear about is very individualistic.
Mm.
Like it's all about having your own supplies and bugging out to your own secret location.
Right. It's like the lone wolf mentality. But the Portuguese prepper makes a really strong case for why that might not be the most effective strategy, especially in an urban environment.
Okay, so what does he suggest instead?
Well, he talks about the importance of building what he calls resilient neighborhood networks.
Okay, so what does that actually look like?
Think about it. During a crisis, official channels of communication might break down. The news could be unreliable. Emergency services could be totally overwhelmed. But if you have a network of trusted neighbors who you can communicate with and rely on.
Then you have a whole different set of resources and information channels that you can tap into.
Exactly. And it's about more than just, sharing information. It's about coordinating your efforts, pooling your resources. He even talks about setting up neighborhood watch programs and creating a system for checking in on vulnerable residents.
So it's about moving beyond that every man for himself mentality and recognizing that in a crisis situation, collaboration is key.
Exactly. He uses this really great analogy about how a single twig can be easily broken, but a bundle of twigs is much stronger.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I imagine that sense of community can also be a really powerful psychological boost. Knowing that you're not alone in facing this situation can make a huge difference.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about how those social connections can be just as important as having food and water. Because during a prolonged crisis, isolation and loneliness can be just as debilitating as any physical threat.
That's a really good point. We've covered a lot of ground here, from recognizing those early warning signs to developing an escape plan, fortifying your home, packing the right gear.
Hmm.
We've talked about the mental and emotional aspects of preparedness and the importance of community resilience. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this guy.
Yeah, there's so much in here. And I think that's what makes it so valuable. It's not just a checklist of things to buy. He really makes you think critically about all the different aspects of urban survival and offers a very holistic approach to preparedness.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step for someone who's been listening to this and thinking, okay, this is all pretty fascinating. I want to learn more.
Well, I mean, the guide itself is a fantastic starting point. He goes into a lot more detail on all the topics that we've talked about and provides a ton of additional resources.
He also really emphasizes that preparedness is a journey,
Hmm.
right? It's not like you reach some magical level of readiness and then you're done.
Right. It's about constantly learning, adapting your plans, and practicing your skills because the world is always changing and the types of threats that we face are always evolving too.
So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of preparedness. It's about cultivating a mindset of resilience and resourcefulness.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that preparedness isn't just about surviving a crisis. It's about thriving in the face of adversity.
That's a great way to put it. So for those of you who are feeling inspired to level up your preparedness game, the Portuguese Prepper's Guide is definitely worth checking out. And we'll be back in just a minute to wrap up our discussion with some final thoughts and key takeaways. Okay, so we're back. And, I got to say, after spending all this time with this urban prepping guide, it's really kind of changed my perspective a little.
Yeah.
I used to think prepping was all about stockpiling supplies and like hunkering down in a bunker somewhere. But this guide is so much more than that. It really emphasizes the human element.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that makes the Portuguese prepper's approach so unique. He doesn't just focus on the practical skills and the gear. He really gets into the psychological and social aspects of preparedness too.
Right. It's not just about surviving a crisis. It's about, maintaining your well-being, your sense of community, your ability to adapt and thrive in really challenging circumstances.
He talks about how important it is to cultivate this prepper mindset, which is basically a combination of awareness, resourcefulness, and a willingness to learn and adapt. It's about being proactive instead of reactive.
And that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
Because even with the best gear and the most detailed plan, if you're not mentally and emotionally prepared, you're going to struggle when things get tough.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes things like those stress management techniques that we talked about earlier, like the tactical breathing and the visualization exercises. But he also goes beyond that and talks about the importance of having a strong support system.
Which goes back to that whole idea of community preparedness that we
Yeah.
discussed, right?
Yeah.
It's about having people you can rely on, people who can offer practical help, but also emotional support and a sense of shared purpose.
Exactly. And he even talks about the importance of staying informed and engaged with your community, even in times of peace. Because the more connected you are to the people and resources around you, the more resilient you'll be when a crisis actually hits.
So it's not just about prepping for like a specific event. It's about cultivating a way of life that emphasizes preparedness and resilience and connection.
That's a really good way to put it, and I think that's a very empowering message, too. It means that preparedness is something that we can all work towards, regardless of our circumstances.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about recognizing warning signs, creating escape plans, fortifying our homes, packing essential gear, and cultivating both mental and community resilience. But if there's one key takeaway that I want listeners to remember, it's this.
Preparedness is not about living in fear. It's about taking control of your destiny and empowering yourself to navigate whatever challenges life throws at you.
That is a great way to put it. It's about embracing knowledge, building skills, and fostering connections that will make you more resilient and resourceful in any situation.
And just remember, preparedness is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn, more skills to develop, and more ways to connect with your community.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of urban prepping. We hope you found it valuable and empowering. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep exploring the world with curiosity and a thirst for knowledge.